me begin the story of Nigeria in order to put it into perspective by talking about a war that's been going on for almost 1,400 years. It's a war that began in the 7th century with the rise of a new and powerful religion called Islam. And Islam was an aggressive religion that went out to conquer an empire, which it succeeded in doing. In the process of doing it, the Muslims had to conquer the large part of another world dominated by another religion called Christianity. And already in the 7th century, a war began between Muslims and Christians, which basically has in some way continued until the 21st century, the hostility between the Muslim worlds and the Christian worlds. Today, the Christian world, much secularized, confronts the power of a Muslim fundamentalism with considerable fear. Now, the Arabs went out to found the Muslim empire. In the process, they conquered many other nations which became part of this Muslim world. They conquered the Syrians and the Chaldeans and the Egyptians and the Berbers in North Africa, Persians and the Turks. And then they invaded India and they conquered a large part of the Hindi or Hindustani people. But one of the conquests of the Muslims is less well known and is relevant to our story. They did penetrate into Europe. They conquered Spain and held it for several centuries. They invaded the Balkans. That's why we have Muslims in the Balkans, in Kosovo and Bosnia. And they reached the gates of Vienna. But they also crossed the Sahara. And they came down into what we call Black Africa. And in fact, they conquered a large part of it. As a result, there is a place in Africa which we call the Sudan. The Sudan is a grassland that stretches all the way from the east to the west. The grassland is a little bit like the American prairie, although the grass is quite different, and because of the expansion of the drought that comes south because of the expanding Sahara Desert, it doesn't look the way it looked 5 centuries ago or 10 centuries ago. But this area south of the Sahara became an area of Muslim expansion. And we call this prairie, the name in Arabic for it is the Sudan. So let me just remind you of what I call the different geographic areas of the northern part of Africa. First, we have something that we call the rainforest. And the rainforest is in this area here, mainly in the central and western parts. Then above the rainforest is the Sudan. And then trailing into the Sahara, if you've ever been there, it isn't like all of a sudden it says prairie, desert. You know, it's like it's sort of gradual. There's something that we call the acacia parkland. There are lots of acacia trees. The land is sort of dryish, but it can be used for agriculture. It's not really the desert yet. It's called the Sahel. And then it sort of fades into, also you bump into a dune. It sort of fades into the Sahara, and then you have the vast Sahara, which reaches almost to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, obviously, one of the most difficult things was crossing the Sahara. The Muslims had conquered North Africa. They did that in the 7th century. In fact, they reached the Straits of Gibraltar by the end of the 7th century, and then they crossed over into Spain. But they couldn't cross the Sahara. They had an animal that could cross the Sahara, the camel, which had come from Central Asia. But it was such a formidable trip. The only way to penetrate the Sahara, which was done initially, was to go up the Nile. That is, if you got in a boat on the Nile River, you could go up the Nile, and then once you got down here, you could come all the way across here, and there was that level of penetration. In fact, the first area to become Muslim was here in what we call the Central Sudan. And this country has preserved the name of the Sudan. The Sudan is actually this whole area. This country took the name of the prairie. And then they came across the grassland. But the penetration was not very strong. There wasn't a great economic motivation because there wasn't anything up here that anybody really wanted. But there was something over here that people wanted. It's called gold. I mean, I can see from the faces here some people don't care about gold, but there are some people who like gold. And so there was something here. There's an area here which is to be found in what today are the states of Guinea and the Ivory Coast, up in the hills where there were extensive gold deposits. And getting to them was very important. And the Arabs never succeeded. The Arabs came up the Nile River, but they were in the wrong place, and they come all the way across the Sudan. They weren't prepared to do that. But we know that in the 9th and 10th centuries, there was a group of people who managed to really penetrate to the gold. Now, the reason the gold was discovered, there was a kind of trade route that was established even in Roman times, because at one time, North Africa was controlled by the Romans. They had conquered the Egyptians and the Berbers, and that was part of the Roman Empire, and these people were Christianized. This was all part of the what? The Christian Empire. And a trade route was established between the gold fields across the Sahara, not easy to cross, all the way to Mauritania, which was a Roman province. Today it's called Morocco. And so they went up and down. The trade wasn't very extensive because the trip was absolutely formidable. And the trade that existed was interesting. The Africans who were down here, the black Africans, had gold. What the Romans had up there was salt. And today, salt is much maligned, as you know. But there was a time when it was praised. And so they brought the salt down here, and they traded it for gold. Would you give your salt for gold? No. So, and back and forth, and that was not a lively trade. It actually wasn't until about the 9th and 10th century that a very bold people appeared. Now, the people who live in North Africa, or lived in North Africa before the Arabs came and conquered them, they're still there in large numbers. Many of them have given up speaking their native language of Berber, and now they speak Arabic. But if you go to Morocco, you'll find lots of Berbers still there. The Berber people were the people who penetrated the desert very boldly. And there was a group of Berbers called the Sanhajas. They're still around. They live today, or the remnants of them live in southern Morocco. And they took their camels, and they made it all the way down here. And having made it all the way down there, they saw no reason to trade. Instead of trade, just conquer. That means the what? The gold now belongs to you. And so they established a very, very meaningful route. And down that route poured what we call Muslim invaders. So there were two ways to get to the Sudan. You could come up the Nile and come westward, or you could go straight down from Morocco. In time, the Sudan was taken by the Muslims. By the time you get to the 11th and 12th centuries, the Sudan is a kind of mixed world, but the people who run it and who control it are the Muslims, and the Muslims are mixed. Some of them are Arabs who came down this way. Some of them are Berbers who came down that way. And if you mix an Arab and a Berber, you get a hybrid, which is called a Moor. So they're all over here. And now the Muslim empire has expanded. It's expanded into the world of black Africa. So let me try to describe the people that they found that were there. There are three groups of black Africans who lived in the area. In the west part, certainly part of what we call northern Nigeria today, there is the homeland of what we call the Negro race. The Negro part of the black race has provided the ancestors who were taken as slaves to North and South America, because they mostly came from West Africa. In addition to that, there was a people, a black people who lived in the Upper Nile, who are shaped differently from the Negroes. They're taller and thinner, the Maasai, the Tutsis, and so forth. And they're called Nilotic people, and they also lived here. They were often intermixed because often they were nomadic. And so you would have a village of Negro, village of Nilotics, and then a third group of people came. They were people that had started most likely in Arabia and before the Arabs, and had crossed over into Egypt and come all the way here. These people are called the Hamites. The Hamites in North Africa are called Berbers, but some of them came by a different route. They went to the south and crossed over where Yemen is and crossed over into here and came across and mixed racially with the people who were there. So by the time the Muslims arrived, they were essentially part of the black race, but they were sort of a mixture of Berbers and blacks, and they're called Hamitic people, and they're all over here. And they're all mixed together when the Muslims arrived. Now, the culture of these people is very important because the kind of Islam that developed there was a function of the culture of the people who were there at the beginning. First of all, most of the people who were in the Sudan when the Muslims arrived had not yet arrived at the state where they had become nations. First you have families, then families band together and you have what? Clans, and then clans band together and you have tribes. When tribes band together, you have nations. They hadn't reached that stage of social development, and they had reached a stage of tribal development that you read about in anthropology. Tribes ultimately develop a government in which a single person called a chief governs. And they had reached the stage where they had chiefs, and the chiefs were regarded almost as gods. In fact, when they died, their spirits were worshipped just the way you might worship the gods. The chiefs ruled as absolute monarchs, and they brooked no opposition. In addition, the culture featured a religion which was built on the worship of chiefs and the worship of ancestors. We call that religion by name, which comes from Benin, next to Nigeria. We call it voodoo. And it was an elaborate religion with gods who most likely started out as chiefs, as dead chiefs, and ultimately a world filled with ancestral spirits that needed to be appeased. A great deal of time is spent by the people there still in what we call unique acts of religion. They are so concerned with the spirit world that they are sometimes obsessed by it, and bringing offerings to the spirit world, appeasing the spirit world, talking to the spirit world is very, very important. It's an important part of the culture. It obviously was not Islam. It had what? Many gods. And also symbols of the gods. Now, the symbols of the gods were sometimes sculptures, and sometimes they were masks. These African masks have become very, very valuable. The masks were used in dances at religious rituals. The person became the god and danced as the what? And danced as the god. So the mask itself became a symbol. The culture featured something that was perfectly compatible with Islam: polygamy. The status of women in this culture was not high. That is, men had many wives. The role of the wife was indeed to serve her husband, and that was a compatibility. When the Muslims conquered Christians, there was an incompatibility because Christians were monogamous and Muslims were polygamous. But in this world, there was a compatibility. And it was a world filled with warfare. There was war over land, and also one of the purposes of war was to take slaves. So instead of waiting for immigrants to arrive to do your housework, what you did was you got yourself a little army and you went out and raided another tribe and captured some of those people and then brought them back. And they serve either as domestic slaves or field slaves or whatever else it is. The societies were not so highly developed that the distinction had really yet emerged, but there was warfare and there was slavery, and there was trade. I talked about the trade already existing in Roman times. There was trade between the tribes and among the tribes, and there was trade across the Sahara with the north. There was no trade this way, because there was nothing this way. That is, everything looked, if you had trade, everything looked to the north. And of course, I've already described the art. The art, African art is now what? I mean, it's very chic. The art was attached to the voodoo, to the religion of the people, and into this world intruded the Muslims, Berbers and Arabs. And what they did in the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th, and 14th centuries is that they established Muslim kingdoms in this area. And these kingdoms were kingdoms of great power and great wealth. There was a foundation, certainly, of agriculture, but there was also access to the gold. And so let me mention some of the kingdoms that emerged here. The first kingdom that we know of that was around here had Muslims in it, but it was still governed by native Negroes. It's called the Kingdom of Ghana. This country, which used to be called the Gold Coast, simply appropriated the name. Ghana actually was farther north. It was somewhere around this river which dominated West Africa. It rises in the mountains where the gold is, makes a curve north, and then comes all the way down and empties into the Atlantic. It's one of the great rivers of Africa. There is the Nile, there is the Zambezi, there is the Congo, and there is either, you can call it either the Niger or the Niger, this river. And in fact, Ghana was built around it. What followed Ghana was a kingdom called Mali. Now that name has also been appropriated by one of these African states, but Mali also covered a much bigger area, and we know in the case of Mali that its ruling class was Muslim. In fact, one of the great Negro peoples in the Sudan, the Mande people, were converted to Islam, and the rulers of the Mali kingdom were Mande. And then that was followed by another major Negro tribe that was converted to Islam. So first the Berbers came and the Arabs. They governed. Then they converted major tribes, which now federated and turned into nations, and now these Muslim black nations dominated, what you will, the area. And then, after the Songa, who came after the Mande, after Mali, the Songa kingdom, it's all the same area. There now appeared another group of people called the Hausa, who established two kingdoms, Kanem and Borno. And then, which is relevant to modern times, there appeared an interesting nomadic people. You can find them in Senegal here, and you can find them all the way in Chad. Doesn't make any difference. They're all over the place. They moved all over the place. Part of the problem with the map as we have it is that the countries that are there have boundaries that were drawn by European nations. They do not correspond to any of the history of the area. Now, the people I'm talking about, they're tall and thin. They're called the Fulani, and they do not engage in agriculture. They only like to work with sheep and goats. You'll never find them as farmers. And the Fulani are a very important part of the story of this place because certainly by the 14th and 15th and 16th century, they become a dominant force, eventually establishing control over much of the Muslim area. And in fact, many Fulani kingdoms exist all the way across the Sudan. So over a period of many, many centuries, there are many changes, but it all remains Muslim. And as time goes on, more and more and more and more of the Negroes indeed become Muslim. Now, the crisis in the Sudan occurred when the gold ran out. When the gold ran out, they have very little to trade with the what? With the North. And in fact, that led to what today we call an economic recession, because the word depression we never use anymore, right? That would frighten people. Do we ever have a depression? We never have a depression. We only have a what? We only have a recession. So an economic recession set in, which triggered more and more warfare, right? The less there was, the more war, the more fighting there was. So the area broke up into many, many small kingdoms, and they were fighting each other and fighting each other and fighting each other. In the middle of this, however, what we call a black Muslim culture emerged. The black Muslim culture, I encountered it when I was in West Africa, is interesting because it retains certain elements of voodoo. That is, you will find people who go to the mosque all the time, but they still will make offerings to their ancestors. I mean, why take chances? The principle is, why take chances? So this kind of black Muslim culture developed. In fact, there was a high culture. A very famous Muslim university was established in this area. The name of it is Timbuktu. Timbuktu, which lies just to the north of the Niger or the Niger River, was a place of university education. Scholars came from all over the Muslim world to study there. So what I'm pointing out to you is, there is a part of the Muslim world that lies south of the Sahara. Now, there were many, many Negroes who resisted becoming Muslims. And as Muslim control became more and more effective, their only alternative, if they did not wish to become Muslim, was to flee south. What lay south of the Sudan was the rainforest. And in fact, many of these people simply fled into the rainforest. People do not voluntarily choose to live in a rainforest. The humans choose rainforests to live in because enemies have driven them into it. And in fact, these people were driven into the rainforest, and in the rainforest they made clearings and they engaged in agriculture. Now, the people who ended up in the rainforests, of course, hated Islam. They were not Christian, but they were what? They were nativist. The word we use, which is often patronizing, I see it in encyclopedias all the time, is animist. An animist is somebody who worships spirits, but it's sort of a pejorative term. It's like pagan, you know, a bunch of pagans. Actually, the religion they had was fairly complex as Islam. The name is obviously voodoo, and that was their religion. And in fact, they did not wish to become Muslims. That's why they ended up in the rainforest. They were down there. And in the rainforest, there emerged in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries, there emerged a series of kingdoms because they had to unite for fear of Muslim conquest and penetration, which form the basis of what today is southern Nigeria. Northern Nigeria is part of the Sudan, right? See, we see Nigeria, say, oh, they're all Nigerians. Well, that's naive. Northern Nigeria is part of the Sudan. Northern Nigeria is part of the what? The Muslim world. Northern Nigeria has Hausa and Fulani, and its connections culturally now in many respects are with people that are in Egypt or Libya or whatever else it is. In southern Nigeria, all along here, by the way, all along the coast, the rainforest, there now appeared these little kingdoms. And let me give you some of the names. There were, in what today is southern Nigeria, right near the mouth of the Niger River, two nations that are important to our story, that emerged in the rainforest. Through the federations of clans and tribes, they came together for defensive purposes. To the west of the Niger mouth is a people called the Yoruba. They're important because a large number of American blacks are descended from the Yorubas. To the east of the Niger or Niger River is a people called the Igbos, and they are to become a very important part of the story. And there were various kingdoms that emerged in the area, both Yoruba and Igbo. One was called Oyo, one was called Benin, one was called Ife, whatever. They fought with each other, but their main job was to resist the penetration coming from the north. In time, they established some form of trade with the states, the Muslim states to the north. And then everything changed. What changed was that the south, the water, which had had no significance at all to the area. I mean, they didn't know how to penetrate the Atlantic. What was the Atlantic? It's a barrier. It's a water barrier. All of a sudden, at the end of the 15th century, the beginning of the 16th century, there arrived from Western Europe European people on ships. And they came around here. The Portuguese were the first, and they kept reaching different places along the African coast. By the 1460s, they were here. And by the 1490s, they had reached the what? The Cape of Good Hope, and they were coming around like this. So now the Europeans came. And when the Europeans came, they landed. They weren't quite sure whether they should stay. What they were interested in initially were fueling stations so that ships coming down could stop and what? Get supplies. But then the ships that came like this also crossed the Atlantic. And they ended up in the West Indies and also in Brazil. And in those places, plantations were established, primarily for the growing of sugar. And now there was a need for cheap labor. First, they sought to enslave the Native Americans, and when these people proved to be bad slaves and often died on them, they went looking for another labor supply, and all of a sudden it dawned on them that this place was what? Filled with people, strong people, who could be slaves. So already in the 16th century, the Portuguese now came back, and their fueling stations now turned into what we call slave stations. The stations operated in various ways. First, they were ships that were anchored outside. And then they actually chose a spot on the mainland. Often, actually, they were islands, little islands off the coast, which could be easily defended and which were turned into castles. And these castles can be observed by any tourist that goes all the way along the coast. Most of them began as Portuguese castles. Well, how'd they get the slaves? Well, did they have expeditions and penetrate and capture people and bring them back? No, didn't have to. What now happened with the arrival of the Europeans, who brought all kinds of goodies with them, including something that now entered into Africa and was to change the nature of warfare. It's called guns. Oh. So now these various voodoo kingdoms that were down here that weren't Muslim, that were close to the sea, now begin to compete for arms. So what they do is they fight each other. Ife raids Oyo, Oyo raids Benin, they fight each other, and in the process of fighting, they what? They take captives, and then they bring them, they sell them to the Portuguese, and later on the Dutch, and later on the French, and later on the British, who come and establish their what? Their slave stations along this place. And now, many of these kingdoms become very prosperous. They make a lot of money. They get a lot of guns. And they get a lot of European goods. And now they're no longer interested up here. They don't care about the Muslims. The Muslims don't have what? Anything to offer them at all. Now their whole vision turns from looking northward to looking southward. And now they establish this connection here. Now initially, the Portuguese and the Dutch and so forth did not do something they did in other places. They didn't bring missionaries. Why? Well, it seemed inappropriate to convert people and then to enslave them. And then to enslave. It didn't, somehow or other, it didn't seem what? It didn't seem to be the right thing to do. So they simply enslaved them. And the second reason was that Europeans discovered that if you wanted to die young, you settled down here. In my travels in West Africa, I kept running across old cemeteries. They were old European cemeteries. They were always filled with missionaries. And you would see that they all died young. They would arrive in 1852, and they would be dead by 1853, because this is tropical rainforest, and the diseases that were there, which many of the blacks were immune to, were what? They decimated whatever European population was there. It was not a fun place like Nairobi or South Africa, where the climate was closer to the European climate. So that was another reason. However, in the 19th century, Great Britain changed the whole thing. Great Britain or England was the first country in Western Europe to enter into the Industrial Revolution. And once it entered into the Industrial Revolution, it no longer needed slave labor. Slave labor was now inefficient. Slave labor is something you use for agricultural work, for sugar plantations. If you're running factories, slave labor is not the most efficient form of labor. They need some level of education for their urban work, and you don't want to have to take care of them when they are no longer needed. Instead of enslaving them and having to take care of them when you don't need them, when the economy is bad, you simply fire them. So slavery actually proved to be now economically obsolete. And when it was, England turned, influenced by many, many people in England who were morally shocked by slavery, in particular after the events of the French Revolution, turned to something called abolitionism. And already by the teens and 20s of the 19th century, the British Navy now took it as a task to kill the slave trade. So British ships now arrived here, and in fact, they stopped slave ships. They didn't care what nation. The British now rule the seas. They did not care. So the poor Portuguese, and now they're the Brazilians, by the way, because Brazil now becomes independent and they still want slaves. The slave trade is canceled out by the British, who now arrive in great force along the coast. And in fact, they seize the slave fortresses and they make them bases for suppressing the slave trade. So now the British have arrived. And having arrived is the age of imperialism. The question now arose, well, do we want to take this place? They'd taken India, they had taken North America, but they decided they didn't want this place because they couldn't figure out what they would do with it, and whatever Englishmen settled down there, died within a year or two, so they didn't want it. The only reason why England would take it would be that somebody else who was her enemy wanted it. So that's the story. In the 1830s, the French, who had never recovered from the defeat of Napoleon, decided to create another empire. The first empire they had created was in America, and they lost it. The second empire they created was in Europe. That was with Napoleon. The third empire was Africa. And they went out to conquer it not because it was economically useful, but because they wanted to have an empire. So they first took North Africa, they took Algeria, and then they established control to some degree over Tunisia and Morocco. They didn't fully annex them until almost the 20th century. And then they came around here, and they established a base in what today we call Senegal. Now, Senegal is at the western end of the Sudan. Senegal is a Muslim area. The French established control there. They established a base. The name of the city is called Dakar. And now they decided to conquer all of northern Africa. They were going to go right across the Sudan. They did that. Senegal they took. Mauritania they took. Mali used to be called the French Sudan. This was now called Burkina Faso, was a French colony called the Upper Volta. And then they came and created a colony named after the river, the Niger. And then they kept moving here to Chad. And then they were going to go all the way across here. When in the 1890s they met a British army. The British Army had already arrived in Egypt. Egypt had become a British possession in the 1880s. And now the British, they were not prepared to allow the source of the Nile to fall into the hands of the French, so they moved down. And there was the battle, and the French were stopped. This part of the Sudan remained part of the British Empire, and this was French. Well, now the French, well, maybe they can't go this way. Now they'll go what? They'll go this way. Well, that was now intolerable. So the British did what they didn't really want to do. They took part of the coast. The French did manage to get to the coast. That's called the Ivory Coast. That was what? That was French. But the British took the Gold Coast, what today is called Ghana. The French came in here with a place called Dahomey, and then the most important conquest of the British. They were going to deny the French the mouth of the Niger River. The river was in French territory, but they wanted the mouth. Now the British took it. Sometimes you do things in life not because they're pleasing to you, but because what? They're displeasing to your enemies. I mean, nobody in this room. You just do them because you don't want the enemy to have control of it. So the British find themselves in control of the mouth of the Niger or Niger River. And ultimately the area gets a name. Because of the Niger River, it's simply called what? Nigeria. And in 1861, the British established a base here. It was for many, many years the capital of Nigeria. It's called Lagos. And from that base, they began to move into the interior to keep the French from what? Coming down. In the 1880s, a conference was held in Berlin because now it was very clear that a third power had entered into the conquest, Germany. And Bismarck in Germany now decided to call a conference so that the English and the French and the Germans and the Portuguese and the Italians could all decide how to divide up Africa. And at the Berlin conference, the British were given permission to take not only the mouth of the Niger, but also the northern territories which were in the Sudan. So between 1886 and 1901, the British marched north. They weren't quite sure what they were taking or why they were taking it. All they knew was they didn't want the French to have it. So they now acquired a vast area. In a flash, just like that. In a matter of 15 years, they have a whole thing. Now, the great personality of this British takeover is a man whose name is to be found all over Nigeria, or used to be found all over Nigeria. His name is Lugard, L-U-G-A-R-D. And he was a lord, so don't call him Mr. He was Lord Lugard, and he was an ultimate British imperialist. And he came and, having occupied the northern territory, he now divided it into two parts. The northern part was in the Sudan and was Muslim. It was a separate colony. It's northern Nigeria. Southern Nigeria was a separate colony. That was what? Voodoo? No, it wasn't voodoo. So now let me tell you what happened. In the 19th century, missionaries now arrived in the area. Because the slave trade was what? Over. Now you wish to what? To convert the natives. Many of the missionaries died from the climate, but enough of them survived to convert millions of Negroes in this area to Christianity. Now, if you pass through the area today, it's one of the most Christian areas in the world. Every few feet, there's another church. and the people are intensely, 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 intensely religious. Often their religion is a mixture of Christianity and voodoo. They still worship their ancestors on the side, and they also do what? Christianity. Now, Christianity was a traumatic experience in many cases for these people. It totally disrupted family life. Because Christianity said you can't have more than one wife. Oh, please. What are we going to do? Well, ultimately they prevailed. And so, when southern Nigeria was established, although there were still many, many purely voodoo people in the area, hundreds of thousands had now been converted to Christianity. And then, in 1903, Lugard, who represented the Royal Africa Company, which was responsible for the occupation and exploitation of the area, decided to merge them into one. And out of that came the British colony of Nigeria, which was an odd collection. It had a Muslim north and a what? A Christian south, and the hostility between the northern part and the southern part was age-old because it preceded Christianity. It goes all the way back to the what? The resistance of the voodoo against the Muslims. Now, what is interesting is that as a result of the British and French intrusion, a series of nations were created, or colonies, which were half Christian and half Muslim. The south was Christian. The north, which stuck into the Sudan, was Muslim. If anybody with any sense had drawn the boundaries to fit the personalities of the people who were there, they wouldn't have drawn them this way. The way they drew the boundaries were the following. They said, you can have as much land until the source of the river. Oh. So, the Ivory Coast, which is a French colony. The south is what? Christian. The north is Muslim. Ghana. The south is Christian. The north is Muslim. Togo, which was a German colony, and then was taken over by the French. The south is Christian. The north is Muslim. Benin, which used to be called Dahomey, a French colony. They look like the ribbon farms along the Detroit River during the times of the French. Everybody had to have access to the sea. The south is Christian, the north is Muslim. And Nigeria, the south is what? Christian, the north is Muslim. Now, I do want to tell you that a southern Christian in Benin has more in common with a southern Christian in Togo or a southern Christian in Ghana than he has with a northern person in Benin. I mean, it's an artificial thing. There's a line here, and it was a line of hostility. Now, when the Christians came from Europe to this part of Africa and converted the natives, the people back home had already become secularized. That is, Western Europe by the 19th century was not an intensely religious place anymore. It had found capitalism and the consumer culture. It had other interests. But these people, when they became Christians, became what? Intensely Christian, the way the Muslims became what? Intensely Muslim. And when you get two groups of people who are intensely religious living next to each other, you don't get interfaith banquets. The only way you get interfaith banquets is if you have two groups of people who have different religions but who are fairly secularized. Then they don't want to kill each other. But if you have two very, very intensely religious, do you understand? Religious people living next to each other, what they want to do is what? I'm right, you're wrong. Well, fine. So the next thing you have is what? War. And one of the great problems of the British from the beginning in this incredibly large colony with an incredibly large population was the fact that the people in the South hated the people in the North, and the people in the North hated the people in the South. So now let me tell you about the ethnic composition of Nigeria. In the South, there were two main Christian nations. One living to the west of the Niger, that's called the Yoruba. One living to the east of the Niger, that's called the Igbo. And in the north, there were two Muslim nations. One were called the Hausa, of Hamitic origin, and the other were also called the Fulani. Remember the Fulani? They were there. And in fact, in the north, the towns in the north were governed by Muslim sultans. There was the Sultan of Sokoto. There was the Sultan of Kano. Two different cultures and great hostility. And from the beginning, the British tried to do something. So let me try to tell you what the British did between 1903 and 1960 when they departed. Well, first, they brought in administrators. Their problem from the very beginning was that not many British people wanted to go and live in Nigeria. The climate was what? Not suitable. If you said Kenya or Kenya, ooh, we'll go. If you said South Africa, what? Ooh, we'll go. If you said India, ooh, we'll go. If you said Nigeria, listen, hey, got another thing on the another assignment on the list. They didn't always get the best, but they got administrators who were there, and so you didn't have a large white population in Nigeria. The white population that was there was what? They were the leftovers of the administrators, and the first thing they had to tend to was to explain why they were there, namely the economy. Was there any way to make money in Nigeria? The answer was yes. Oh, how? Well, there are two things which can be mainly grown in the South. One is cacao, which produces that wonderful thing called chocolate and other things. And the second thing, which was used for all kinds of purposes, cooking and otherwise, was palm oil, extracted certainly from the special palm plant. And what they did was they simply cultivated this palm plant, whatever it was, got this palm oil, and that was shipped off mainly to Europe. It provided some revenue. Nigeria wasn't an overwhelmingly profitable enterprise. The next thing they did was to build an infrastructure. The British built railroads wherever they went. This was the great railroad era. They built railroads so that the various parts of the country could be connected, and they also built roads. They also established schools. In the establishment of schools, however, they had a problem in finding European personnel. So they now what? They encouraged missionaries to come. And the missionaries now came, and the coming of the missionaries only aggravated what? Whatever religious differences there were. The missionaries were reluctant to go into the north, because that was Muslim territory, and converting Muslims to Christianity was not easy. So they generally avoided that, which meant that the education level of the north was inferior to that of the south. Most of the educated Nigerians were Christians in the south. That's where the missionaries were. One of the things they did, however, since they had insufficient numbers of soldiers and police, was to train natives for the police. Now, the one thing the Muslims liked to do was the army. So if the teachers and administrators were Christians, the native army was what? Muslim, and now you can see the future of Nigeria. If the army and the police are mainly Muslim, if the British should ever leave, who will take over? The teachers? Who have the guns? It will be the military, and already there was built into the whole thing this problem. And then already by the 1930s and 1940s, through pressure internally, they allowed some kind of small parliament to be created. In time, the British were ready to leave, and they were forced to leave by a very simple thing. Charles de Gaulle, in 1960, decided to liberate, to allow all the French colonies to become what? Independent. It was after the war in Algeria was lost, and he was now trying to redefine the way the French could relate to the whole area. Having done that, it was impossible for the what? The British colonies to remain. So by 1960, Nigeria was granted its independence. And just as it was granted its independence, the British found a reason to stay. Just in 1960. Not fair. They found oil. Huge, huge reservoirs of petroleum right at the mouth of the Niger River. Is that fair? They're working with cocoa and palm oil, investing all this money and trying to keep these Muslims and Christians together, the whole thing, and now oil. Well, the British wanted to keep their finger in the oil, even though they allowed Nigeria to become independent, and they did for a while. In 1960, it became independent. In 1963, the Nigerian parliament threw out the queen. She was the queen of Nigeria the way she was the queen of Canada, right? And now they became just a republic. And from the very beginning, they decided, well, who is going to be the head of this government? Well, very simple. They had three parties. Why do they have three parties? Well, they had a party in the north, which was the what? The Muslim party. The leader of that was a man by the name of Balewa. And then they had in the south two parties. The Christian vote was divided. There was the Yoruba vote and the Igbo vote, and the Yorubas and the Igbos did not like each other, although culturally they were what? Very close. Because the Christians were divided, the Muslims were always what? Winning. So Balewa wins the election. He becomes the first president of the country. And the Muslims are now in charge. They have all the good jobs. And now the Christians in the South, who regard themselves as superior in education, they're the people who are responsible for business and whatever else it is. They don't like it. So in 1966, an Igbo general, there were a few Christian generals. His name is Ironsi, leads a coup. And in fact, the Balewa government falls. Now, of all the Christians, the ones the Northerners hate the most are the Igbos. The Igbos are the most commercial of the people. And in fact, Igbo commercial people sort of moved into the northern part, since the Muslims didn't like to do commerce and trade.
Now, everything you want to know about the township that you're so proud of is just a click away. www.bloomfieldtwp.org. From the administration to services and much more. So visit Bloomfield Township's very own website today to discover what you never knew at www.bloomfieldtwp.org. That's the official website for the community that you call home. www.bloomfieldtwp.org.